Thanks very much, Michael. Yes, as Michael described it, it sounded a little bit like a cut and shut, this project. They took two proposals and they pushed them together, and they have actually it's a rather interesting task of trying to make that work across two people who had slightly different modelling approaches, came from slightly different disciplines, but had focused, both sets of work had actually focused on quite similar rather policy-driven problems, and the result of it is the Transit project, and that is, the fuller title is We're Modelling Transition Risk, and it has two main components, I suppose. One is its direct applicability to a very pertinent policy question, the question of climate change and the transition to a net zero carbon economy, and second, a kind of methodological aim, which is to bring together into a macroeconomic framework three existing components that come from somewhat outside the periphery of macroeconomics: input-output analysis, agent-based modelling, and Stockconsistent modelling. So we have a very direct relevance to policy, which I'll come back to at the end, but the broad challenge really is to develop methodology. The timescale we were just this cut and shut process is really just in the making. So we signed the contract, I think, in July, and we're delivering in October next year. The partners are CUSP, which I lead at Surrey, University of Surrey, and SPRU, Tim Foxon from SPRU, and also Tommaso Ciali from SPRU, and his collaborator Marco Valenti from the University of L'Aquila in Italy. And we have this aim to develop a macroeconomic framework capable of looking at these issues. So to come to the policy relevance, Mark Carney has been amongst the most outspoken of conventional establishment actors talking about the importance of climate change, and has made a distinction between, a useful distinction between physical risks, which is the risks that climate change poses to the economy, to society, and indeed to the planet, and transition risks, which are the risks associated with trying to mitigate the physical risks and move towards a net zero carbon economy. And as you may know, just before she stepped down from Downing Street, Theresa May committed the UK to a net zero target by 2050. It's an interesting target. It was also interesting, of course, that Philip Hammond immediately stood up and said, sorry, that's too expensive. So you immediately got that sort of economy reality check on a nice environmental goal. But actually the evidence from IPCC says that net zero by 2050 is actually pushing at our boundaries of luck. So the global budget to remain within a 2/3 chance of 1 point maximising our global warming impact at 1.5 above pre-industrial averages. There's a global carbon budget to the rest of the century, so till 2100, of 420 gigatons. That's for the whole world. So it was an interesting question to ask, what does that mean for the UK? And if any sort of suggestion of a fair carbon budget, which allowed for some developments in the poorest countries in the world, actually brings that down to about 2.5 billion tonnes of CO2 that we can afford to emit between now and the end of the century. And our annual consumption on a consumption basis of carbon is around just under 600 million tonnes of carbon, which the maths is fairly easy. Within 5 years, our carbon budget is exhausted. So we were interested in looking at a few pathways towards that. These are pathways towards the net zero target that we need in order to stay within a carbon budget. And business as usual, which is what you're looking at here on find my little green pointer. Yeah, there we go. Business as usual up to there. If you continue that trend decarbonisation, as I was mentioning, that basically you've blown the carbon budget in about 5 years' time. And actually even a linear pathway to 2050, a linear reduction to 2050 really doesn't get you there either. You've blown the budget. And interestingly, the latest that you could go on a linear pathway to net zero turns out to be 2025. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Extinction Rebellion, but that is basically Extinction Rebellion's target for net zero, what they're asking for on the streets. Out on the streets tomorrow again with the school strikers arguing actually that we should be decarbonising our economy, going for net zero within the space of well under a decade. Now, if you decarbonise faster in the early years, you can get around that. So here is a year-on-year reduction, but the lowest year-on-year reduction that you can get away with staying in the budget and going right up to 2050 is a 24% reduction year-on-year in carbon emissions, which turns out in the early years to be harder than a linear pathway, and obviously in the later years you've got that tail. But the interesting feature of it is actually that, again, by about 2030, you're within 5% of net zero from where we are at the moment, which really does suggest that early immediate action in terms of decarbonisation is an essential component of remaining within what the scientific community has said is a legitimate target that gives us a decent chance of maintaining global warming to within 1.5 degrees. So that's our kind of, if you like, our policy starting point. What can we say about economic transition at that scale? And the implications of these kind of policy targets, as I said, are beginning to become obvious, in particular within the financial sector, which is a very recent and absolutely fascinating phenomenon, that you have people like Mark Carney, who really now does get it, and you have Benoit Cœuré from the ECB. I would argue that the horizon at which climate change impacts the economy has already shortened. Climate change is not something happening out there 2050 and beyond. Actually, its impacts are right here and now, particularly if we want to take into account the mitigation of physical risk. But that brings forward, as you react more speedily to the physical risk, what it brings forward is this idea that Carney and others have talked about of transition risk. What's happening to your economy under this scale of transition? And there are a number of features of this kind of transition. So the one most obvious is a very, very rapid structural change. You're replacing technologies, you're replacing systems of provision, you're replacing supply chains at an enormous speed if you really want to get decarbonisation at the kind of rates that those scenarios imply. So that idea of rapid structural change is increasingly important. Obviously, you can't do that without investment. So you're talking about massive investment programs, which are much more typical of a wartime economy than a post-war, post-industrial economy, in which, in fact, infrastructures are much slower in turning over. So you're talking about a shift from a normal economy to something that represents a very outside the normal in terms of investment shifts. And here is something that speaks to some of the presentations in the first session, particularly to the first presentation, is that calls up what we might call post-normal behaviours. So behaviours which are out of the ordinary, which are difficult to calibrate, where you cannot usefully empirically estimate from past behaviours, where expectations change very radically, and indeed where you get new ideas that stimulate what you might call anxiety, as Lisa and Sayantan did in the first presentation, and that these have an impact on the way that consumers behave, producers behave, investors behave, savers behave, and indeed in the ways in which governments respond. So these three broad features of a net zero transition were what we take as the basis to inform what we need in order to explore the concept of a net zero transition. But just to look, before I show you what those features are, just to look at the way in which the transmission channels of transition risk might work. So the most obvious thing, I suppose, is that you're changing your technology, which means that the owners of the existing assets face the problem which has been called asset stranding. And since this is a little bit old, it's a couple of years old now, this FTSE 100 graph, but basically you're looking at up to 40% of the FTSE 100 index which may be exposed to asset stranding when you consider the sectors that are going to be under attack: oil and gas, coal mining, energy intensive sectors and power generation but they constitute already 50% of your FTSE 100. And so your exposure to asset stranding is potentially something which is non-trivial even to start with. What happens when those assets begin to be stranded? What happens to companies? Well, first of all, you might see an increase in loan defaults. You certainly might see the collapse in certain stock prices, so you get equity market collapse. Those things begin to happen. Weaker firms will default probably first. Stronger firms may be able to sustain a little bit. And high carbon equities are likely to lose their value quite fast. What happens on the back of that, of course, is that the people who loaned to those firms become exposed, both through the default on the loan and indeed through the change in the balance sheet as a result of the loss of the value of equities that they might hold for capital adequacy requirements, for example. So again, you're looking at second round effects that begin to bring the financial system into play, and that in its turn, of course, produces real economy effects, both through price changes in assets and indeed in the energy sector itself, but also in the potential that actually households are facing falling net worth. And in some of the models that we're using, which are post-Keynesian models, net worth is one of the arguments of consumer spending. If your net worth falls, consumer spending falls, you begin to look at a loss of consumer confidence, and you look, and the output of that is actually effects on the real economy. And beyond that, social impacts, rising unemployment, falling wage share actually could lead to rising inequality. And if, as in many of these models, you assume that actually the poorest people spend most of their income and save less of it, that creates changes again, suppressing demand even further through financial markets, through real economy markets, and through the rate at which this transition is happening. So you want something that is able to incorporate these various threats that might arise, both in the financial economy and in the real economy, as you navigate this transition. And that's the kind of model that we're trying to build. This is a quote from Warwick McKibben. From a monetary perspective, actually, both climate change itself and climate policy, the transition towards a net zero carbon, are supply side shocks to the economy with channels of transmission that go all the way through the financial system, creating a potential for financial instability with knock-on effects to the real economy. So it's a real sort of integrated system in which you need to be able to try to build the connections. So that is really our aim, and it motivates these three components of the model. So first of all, the question of agent-based modelling, and it draws from insights from evolutionary economics that Michael mentioned, has its roots actually in the work of John von Neumann back in the 1930s, looking at the kind of evolution of agents working with each other. It's bringing together those ideas actually that are very much in the background of one of the presentations this morning when you were talking about anxiety and the endogenization of anxiety. Actually, a lot of what is important there is the mechanisms through which agents communicate with each other and indeed transmit or don't transmit anxiety within that situation. And agent-based modeling gives us a kind of multiplicity that allows us to look at what happens when you have multiple agents in the model who are able to interact with each other. The principal broad framework that we're using is due to the Stockconsistent macroeconomics of Wynne Godley and Marc Lavoie. And this is a very interesting feature of Stockconsistent modelling, is that it takes the obvious insight that money always comes from one place and goes to another place, so that any expenditure for someone is an income for someone else, any asset for one person is a liability for someone else. And what this does when you put it into a macroeconomic model and code it into the macroeconomic model and get it right, which as I'll indicate is not always the easiest thing in the world, is it creates a kind of framing, it creates in a sense a kind of constraint around agent behavior of the kind that you were indicating in that earlier presentation. And it has in itself some very interesting effects on model behavior as you develop it. And then the third, which is an older tradition, but is very important because we're talking about structural changes, the input-output analysis that has widely been used in ecological economics to look at structural change and the implications of the dependency of one sector in the economy on another sector in the economy. So the task for us is really to build those things together. There on the left is John von Neumann. Vasily Leontiev was the architect of the input-output framework, as he was of the Leontiev production function, interestingly. And there on the right is Wynne Godley's charming features, who was the architect of stock-flow-consistent macroeconomics. Interestingly, Wynne Godley was married to Kitty Epstein, who was the daughter of Jacob Epstein, who was a sculptor, as you may know. And he sculpted the statue of St. Michael's victory over the devil on Coventry Cathedral after the Second World War, and Wynne's features were used as the model for St. Michael's victory over the devil. So I'm not casting either St. Michael or the devil in this story, you understand. So that's kind of what we're doing. This is a very broad overview. I might expect a red card from this. But it's a broad system overview of one part of the cut and shut. So we haven't actually got the full cut and shut model in there at the moment, but this is an early iteration of a model which has multiplicity in sectors, it has multiplicity in households, it has multiplicity of assets, liabilities, it has multiplicity in production in firms, and this is the kind of multiplicity that is needed to achieve the sort of exploration of transition that we're trying to achieve in this project. And actually further below this sectoral multiplicity, we are also building agent multiplicity, so different agents within different sectors might have different marginal propensities to consume, they might have different animal spirits that would encourage them to invest more or less fully, they might have different levels of anxiety, which we haven't figured out how to integrate, but we will with Lisa's help, and so on and so forth. And the big challenge of this project actually is to make that agent-based behavior in itself stock flow consistent, which means adding up all of those incomes and expenditures and ensuring that you haven't got leakage out of the system somewhere. And that's a task that is perennial to stock flow consistent modelling, so much so that those who spend a lot of time in stock flow consistent modelling spend a lot of time in an activity which I like to call chasing zero, or chasing zeros, which is essentially making sure that your transactions in your transaction flow matrix are always adding up both vertically and horizontally to zero, because if you don't get that, you're not modeling an economy, you're modeling something else that looks as though it might be an economy but doesn't satisfy those basic framing criteria of stock flow consistency. And one of the interesting things that emerges out of that stock flow consistent modeling is the ability to actually have quite simple conceptual models which look at the underlying dynamics within an economy. And I just want to illustrate this. I'm kind of glad I put this in after the presentation this morning around anxiety. This is a much simpler model, and it arose actually from an inquiry that myself and Peter Victor were engaged in around the potential for a steady state economy. And one of the long-standing arguments has been that if you have interest-bearing debt in an economy, you can't actually achieve a steady-state economy. And the insights of stock flow consistency actually say that it is possible to achieve a steady-state economy. I haven't put it up there because it doesn't look very interesting. Not much is happening. GDP is flat. The growth rate is flat. But one of the things we were interested when we had managed to show that credit doesn't in and of itself create a growth imperative was how stable is that. So the first thing we did was shock the model, and yes, good, it returned to an equilibrium. But we also know that models can return to equilibrium. Economies don't always return to equilibrium in quite the same way, and there were certainly circumstances under which financial instability and economic instability could arise when you shock an economy. So one of the ways that we looked at to achieve that was to add in the kind of the opposite of anxiety, if you like, or to add a component that was trying to model Keynes's animal spirits. And essentially, we have a partial adjustment function on investment, and the way that we modeled that animal spirits was to add a component, a coefficient to that partial adjustment coefficient to either increase it or decrease it. And so we could add increased animal spirits. And what that did was essentially mean that people overestimated the amount of investment they need in a boom time and underestimated it in a lag time. And that gave us actually an instability in the economy. So we could generate that instability by parameterizing something like anxiety, although it'd be interesting to reflect on exactly what that relationship is. And we also began to say, well, you know, what could we do in the face of that kind of intervention from animal spirits into the stability of the economy? The standard classical Keynesian response would be to say, actually, you have counter-cyclical spending by government. And we tested that, and in this case, it worked. This is a very, very simple conceptual model, and the multiplicity and the endogeneity that we want to add to that kind of behavioral work in the work that we're carrying out in this project is both in terms of the multiplicity of sectors, but also in terms of this potential for what we might call contagion. And I just want here to make a note of that. I don't know if you've seen this yet, but this is absolutely relevant to a lot of the discussions that we're talking this morning. Robert Schiller's new book on narrative economics, which very much talks about the contagious impact of anxiety-led narratives that create change in economic systems, and that's one of the things that we hope to do. These are some of the things that we hope to explore. It comes at a very useful time because the Bank of England has just announced in June a process of stress testing the resilience of the financial system, and our project will run more or less parallel with that, and we have a meeting with the Bank of England the week after next to talk about, hopefully, how to make that most relevant to their work. Thank you very much.